relationship between constitutional law and the civil rights movement is the subject of compelling historiography and some of the most significant cases in American legal history. Classes on the subject present opportunities for students of law and American history to be exposed to both prize-winning revisionist history and documentary films and the fundamental law related to the Civil War amendments. But more important now than ever, the subject includes a still living history to which students can be personally exposed. This documentary, Volume 2 in our series on this project, includes video and photos of law students from the Stetson College of Law and undergraduate and graduate students in history and political science from the University of South Florida and Stetson University in DeLand, as they experienced the oral history of this subject in the summer of 2008. As always, our students had completed substantial preparatory coursework under the direction of Professor Ray Arsenault, myself, and Professor T. Wayne Bailey. In addition to the assigned cases, the major texts included Unlikely Heroes by Kennedy Book Award recipient Professor Jack Bass, Freedom Riders by Owsley Prize recipient Professor Ray Arsenault, and Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement by Bancroft Prize recipient Professor Michael Klarman. In 2008, our teaching project was facilitated by Ernest Rip Patton, one of the original 1961 Freedom Riders. Rip Patton was a 21-year-old music major at Tennessee State University when he joined the Nashville movement in 1960, participating in the Lawson workshops and the sit-ins and other protests of segregation that defined the Nashville movement. He joined the Freedom Rides in 1961 and was in the first group to make it to Jackson, Mississippi, where he was arrested for entering a white-only Greyhound bus station waiting room. The group was ultimately sent to Parchman Prison Farm. Mr. Patton was an active member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and his storytelling throughout our journey significantly influenced the students' understanding of their readings and the oral histories. As in past years, following the completion of our coursework and an extensive review of our itinerary, we met as a group and boarded our bus with both common and personal goals and visions about the connection between our readings and our deeper understanding of the subject of constitutional law and civil rights today. Our first visit is the Albany Civil Rights Museum, where we meet Rutha Harris. An original Albany Freedom singer, Rutha Harris provides students with a powerful introduction to the origin of freedom songs and to the personality of the movement.
The songs of the civil rights movement were taken from gospel songs, congregational hymns, rhythm and blues, and the only thing that we did to make freedom songs was to change the lyrics. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind So the only thing we had to do was change the lyrics of the songs that we knew, to change them to freedom songs. And without the freedom songs, this is my personal opinion, I don't believe that there would have been a movement, because the songs gave us hope. They kept us going. If we were on a picket line or just demonstrating or in jail, the songs lifted our spirits.
Maybe it's obvious, but with the church and the music, but it just seems so brilliant. and maybe we just take it for granted that the changing of words. I mean, do you recollect like how and when that happened? Was someone just inspired?
Spontaneously. Songs would be, like here in Albany, the song that came out of Albany was "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." Reverend Abernathy just started singing. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Gonna let no fire hose. I'm gonna keep on, yeah. March.
As Stan Arthur, our media and post-production specialist, filmed our first interviews, we then met Carol Barner Say, who was arrested at age 12, along with approximately 35 other children during protests in Americus, Georgia in 1963. Known as the Leesburg Stockade Girls, these children were held for 6 weeks in an abandoned stockade. Because movement history places so much emphasis on the role of children in the protests, most notably in Birmingham, I began our interview by asking her to respond to the argument that the children did not understand their role in movement history.
At 12, could I think back then? Yes. Did I fully understand integration? No. Did I understand segregation? The answer is yes. Born in segregation, raised in segregation, went to segregated school. Even today, there's still segregated churches. Went there too. So all I knew was segregation. Did I understand what was going on? Somewhat. All I know that I was a human being and I wasn't treated like my white sisters and brothers. So we was transported from Dawson, thinking we was going to Americus. Couldn't understand why they would transport us by night. Little did we know, we went into a Civil War stockade. And there we stayed for 45 days. Nobody knew where we were. We didn't even know. Parents didn't know. So I never talked about it for 33 years. After that, I thought long and hard. If someone that didn't know about it, wasn't even born then, wrote this story, heard this story, and decided to write about it, to publish it, no matter what it takes, I would never ever let it die again.
One of the most important opportunities was the time the students had following the presentations and interviews to individually meet and briefly bond with movement veterans. These individuals made what John Dewey called acquaintance with the past very personal and took the students' understanding of the subject to another level. Our visit to Charles Sherrod Park was our first encounter with the visual presentation of a community's civil rights history and the powerful use of artistic form as a way of preserving the memory of the people and events that defined the civil rights struggle. At the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, we were able to engage in a brief discussion led by Professor Arsenault of the effectiveness of a multimedia presentation of Dr. King's leadership, who he was as a person, and the purpose of the movement's philosophy. Professor Arsenault and I were able to interact with the students throughout their viewing of the center's many exhibits. Having Rip Patton with us allowed special opportunities for interpretation of the center's exhibits, and included an especially unique moment when our students could watch a piece of actual 1961 television news footage of Mr. Patton stepping off his Freedom Bus in Jackson while he stood with the students in the moment. The students' continuous interaction with each other and with Mr. Patton significantly influenced the small group discussion approach to learning because it took place in this special environment where visual images of our readings surrounded the conversations and created a new level of inquiry. And as always, the emotional aspects of the experience began to become very evident as the students visited the memorial to Martin and Coretta Scott King. Each day at lunch and dinner, students had the opportunity to engage in small group discussions that allowed them to share immediate thoughts and evolving perspectives. Our time in Atlanta included our first panel discussion, with Rip Patton joining fellow Freedom Riders Larry Hunter and Charles Person for a discussion of the reasons they joined the Freedom Rides and their stories of early accounts of Southern resistance. To hear them reminisce about their common resoluteness and the beatings and imprisonment they endured made both law and historiography personally relevant to the students. On our way to Anniston, Mr. Patton and Professor Arsenault reminded students of the original history of the Freedom Rides, retold in Chapter 1 of Professor Arsenault's book, and then the horrible KKK-inspired attack on the first Freedom Rider bus at the Anniston Greyhound Terminal. Following our visitation of this historic site, Mr. H. Brant Ayers, publisher of the Anniston Star, hosted a symposium with Reverend Phil Noble, author of the book Beyond the Burning Bus, longtime civil rights activist Ed Wood, and Charles Doster. All of these men are veterans of the Anniston bus burning experience and Anniston's place in the history and politics of racism and reconciliation.
Anniston has been a place of the Ku Klux Klan for a long time. And everybody was surprised that Anniston wasn't having all the explosion problems like were happening in Birmingham and Selma and elsewhere. The bus was met by the Ku Klux Klan and burned the bus, and that came into prominence. Now, the reaction to that in Anniston probably was that we are sorry it happened in Anniston. We're not sorry it happened. And it was at that point that two black ministers came to me, having gone to all the other preachers in the community who wouldn't even talk to them. They came to me and we started communication. The ministerial associations started meeting together, black and white. And of course, we began to talk about the need for communication.
A lot of things happened during that period. On May 1961 was Mother's Day. Well, I knew the bus was coming through Anniston, but I thought it had gone. I knew they had a problem down at the bus station. They cut the tires, they beat the people, they did a lot of things. But it was Mother's Day, and I was taking my wife out to dinner. And I pulled right up behind the bus out here on Highway 202. Well, I saw that bus burn, not intentionally, but it burned. I jumped out of the car, and I thought it was a bad wreck. Momentarily, I forgot about the Freedom Bus. I just thought it was a wreck, so I jumped out to try to assist however I could. People were piling out the bus. It was burning. They were hollering and screaming, laying all up and down the highway. Somebody let me know that this was not the place for me, to get back in your car and get away from here. So I drove down the road a few blocks and turned around and came back. By the time I got back, the bus had burned out. It wasn't nothing but the frame. It was not a beautiful sight, I promise you. But I went to one of the local foundries and took a job. And I got to be friends with one of the fellows who worked in the office. One morning when I went to work, he was standing at the clock. You had to clock in. And just beyond the clock, just a few steps, there was 2 drinking fountains. One said colored and one said white. He said, Edward, I want to ask you a question. He said, I think I know you well enough. I said, ask me anything you want to ask me. He said, I want to know. He knew that I had been marching. I sat in, I leaned in, I laid in, I done it all. He said, I want to ask you, what is this about? I said, I'm glad you asked me. I said, you see those 2 drinking fountains? He said, yeah. I said, what did they say to you? He said, don't say nothing to me. They've always been there. I said, well, to me, every time I clock in the morning and turn to go in the foundry, it says to me I'm a little less than human. I can have the colored water, but I can't have the white water. I said, but it's a lot more than that. I said, I'm an American just as much as you are. I was born here. I'm not an African, I'm an American. American born, I fought for this country, and I have a right to whatever this country has to offer, and I'll fight for that. I said, I want an opportunity to work a decent job, to buy a decent home, to educate my children. He said, you know, I'm glad I asked you that. He said, I never really thought about it. He said, I don't hate you. I don't hate anybody. He said, this is the condition that I was born in. I've accepted it. He said, I'm glad you opened my eyes.
When I came back just in time to see the man, to learn about the murder of the man that defined my generation, John Kennedy, and to see in the next year a total transformation of the political infrastructure of the South. Barry Goldwater, who opposed the Civil Rights Acts, was running against President Johnson. And in that election, it was as if the strongest segregation wing of the Democratic Party had formed up in ranks and file from their old base in the Democratic Party to a new base in the Republican Party.
Following the symposium, we visited the very site where the bus was attacked and burned outside of Anniston. To stand on the ground where the bus was burned was the first of many experiences of the impact of being on the very ground where civil rights activists stood their ground in moments of violence, inspired by a culture of racial hatred and encouraged by the complicity of local law enforcement and political power structures. During ride time, in addition to viewing documentary film related to our readings and itinerary, the students were able to engage in small focus group discussions with Rip Patton. These discussions enhanced the students' perspective of their readings and the events they were reliving. After leaving Anniston, we traveled to Tennessee State University for an evening panel discussion hosted by Kwame Leo Lillard, one of the most famous Nashville student movement veterans and a lifetime civil rights and political activist. Kwame Lillard introduced us to Matthew Walker Jr., a veteran of the Lawson Nonviolent Workshops, and to Mary Jean Smith and Alan Kaysen, 2 quiet and courageous veterans of the Freedom Rides. Ms. Smith and Mr. Kaysen were examples of the many movement veterans who kept their experiences with Southern resistance within themselves for many years, but who responded to Kwame and Rip's earnest request that they share their unique and compelling stories with our students. And we felt especially honored that they would share with us memories that some movement veterans would rather not recall.
As of July 5th of this year, it's been 1 year and 47 years since 14 courageous Americans stood up and said the Constitution says one thing and the country doing something else. So it's been a long, long fight this 1 year. And it's like you think the clock has been turned back. But you're going to hear that. Sitting next to Rip is Matthew Walker Jr. All right, sitting next to Matthew is this quiet little warrior. Her name is Mary Jean Smith. All right, and sitting next to her is a quieter warrior. His name is Alan Kaysen, and they've got incredible stories.
Gene, what I would like for you to do, but I would like for you to tell the students your story, starting with the day that you made the decision to go on the Freedom Ride and why you made that decision, and what happened to you as far as you can remember.
I had finished up. I didn't go to Montgomery like some of them did and then come back to take my exams. I stayed here, finished my exams, passed everything, looking for a job. And but that Saturday morning I went to work with my mother, and I stayed about to mid-morning, and then I was headed back home, and I was on the bus, and there was a couple of white kids sitting in front of me with the transistor radio, and they said that the Freedom Riders were fasting. And so the little girl said, well, I hope all those ends die. And that's when it hit me that I was supposed to go. I had told them I was not going. I told everybody bye, good luck, and I'd be praying for them. But I got off the bus, I went to the office and I asked Leo, could I still go? He said, yep, the bus leaves at 5. So I ran home and packed my suitcase and called my mother. She didn't want me to go, of course, and she said, well, if you have to, go on. So I did. And I was gone for 39 days. The majority of that time was in Hinds County Jail. And then about 2 weeks, I was in Parchman Penitentiary in the maximum security unit.
It's one thing to leave Nashville and go on a Freedom Ride and be incarcerated, get out feeling free, only to be incarcerated a second time. As a story I told you, when the first wave left Nashville going to Birmingham, and when Bull Connor, as he was bringing them back, Allen was in the wave that was going down to replace that wave that Bull Connor brought back to the line. So when the number increased to about 23 at Birmingham, he was a part of that group that went into Montgomery. So Allen is, when you saw the film, when Freddie Leonard was telling you about the people going over the railing, he and Bernard Lafayette and Allen Kaysen with his little typewriter, that's him right there.
Okay, as I left Parchman, I returned to Nashville. I thought I was free, sure enough. So I'm going home. I'm free now. I'm going home. And I got arrested in Georgia for stirring the peace on the train. When I was arrested for stirring the peace, and I was sentenced to prison for 12 months. During 12 months I had to work on like a chain gang. So I was on a work detail. I had cut grass all day, sundown. I was 19 years old. My hands were real tender at that time, you know. But they got tight around that sling blade where you hold it all day until your hands begin to bleed. I walked down the road there with a sling blade, blood running down my hand and blood running around my ankles here. And you're getting crushed all day. You nigger that, you shouldn't be around a white woman, you shouldn't be in here, all that kind of stuff. I hit it all day. I was abused all day by the guards, called a Freedom Rider. They said I wasn't working fast enough. So they put me in stock confinement for 32 days. In them 30 days, before I put in there, I was beaten, sure enough. So as I went home for a while, and I worked there for a while, and I returned here. But there was something that wasn't right. We had 2 stores here that wasn't restaurants that hadn't integrated. So I hadn't planned to go back to jail again. But I had to, I was obligated to do what was right and what I guess what God had wanted me to do. So October, I got out of jail in February. I got arrested in 61 February. June 1961, and I'm out again. I went back in jail in 62 in October. for a reason. We were sisters and brothers, and we were a team. Always working together. Like say, I didn't know where I worked one time, but I'm still here. And we did it.
Where anybody was.
The sit-ins in Nashville developed from a series of nonviolent workshops which the Reverend James Lawson started at the church I was attending and still attend at the time, Clark Memorial United Methodist Church, which is on 14th Avenue and Phillip Street here in Nashville. I was going to Clark Memorial, and at the same time I was a student a few blocks away at Fisk University. So Reverend James Lawson came here from, I think it was Centenary United Methodist Church in Cincinnati Methodist Church in Memphis, and he started conducting workshops at my church. And he talked about what he had learned in India as far as nonviolence was concerned, and how it had potential for changing the segregation system here in the South. So I listened and paid attention and participated, and we eventually went downtown and had a big sit-in. And that day when I participated, 30, 40, 50, a lot of people were arrested. And that was the first day of mass arrest in the sit-ins here in Nashville. So I continued to participate in the sit-ins over the following weeks. I don't know how many times I was arrested, but it was a good number here in Nashville. And I do remember at one time being in jail and having called home, and I talked with my mother, and as you can imagine, mothers are nervous with their children in these situations. So my mother was a little upset, and she was anxious, and she was talking about the danger and so forth, and so I just had to say, well, be cool, Mama, because, everything's going to be all right. When we were at the house, Dr. Harris's house in Montgomery, there were people there from all over the country. And a lot of the people had made out wills and so forth because, remember, there was the violence in Anniston, Montgomery, and Birmingham, and we didn't know what we were going to face when we got on that bus to Jackson the next day. So we all argued, finally got King to relent, and we got uneventfully onto the bus in Montgomery that morning of the 24th. And I can remember that as we approached Meridian, which is outside the Mississippi-Alabama border, I was maybe near the front of the bus, and I remember looking at the speedometer. We were doing 95 miles an hour. Those people were anxious to get that over with. After we had been in Mississippi for a few miles, the bus stopped, and the National Guardsmen boarded the bus. And the thing that's difficult to realize when you look back on this is how this whole integration question was something that the whole country was very excited about, because the media gave it front page coverage, and it really set the tenor of the times. I think the country was so interested in what was going on is because the authorities probably in Washington really wanted integration to succeed, simply because during that time the United States and Russia were engaged in a Cold War, and a lot of countries were gaining their independence, especially in the Third World, and they wanted the countries to realize that America really did believe in the principles of equality and so forth. So it was a good thing to see integration succeed.
On the morning following our TSU symposium, we visited Fisk University and engaged in a discussion on the lawn of its significance in the formation of the Nashville student movement and its identification with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and his personal proposal of the principles which would eventually define the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. His response to Booker T. Washington's program of economic opportunity, higher education, and the system of social segregation born in Plessy versus Ferguson would be recalled later when we visited Tuskegee University. Our visit to the Nashville Public Library was our singular exposure to a special, nationally recognized collection devoted to the subject of the Civil Rights Movement. Students were briefed about the many aspects of the collection and then had the opportunity to individually experiment with the use of the books, documentaries, news clippings, photographs, and other materials which make up this nationally acclaimed collection. Following our experience with the archives of the movement, we returned to storytelling and met John Siegenthaler at Vanderbilt University's Freedom Center. During their study of this subject, The students have become aware that President John F. Kennedy inherited the issue of civil rights at the time that the protest against segregation was gaining national and international attention. Southern resistance was extremely violent, and state political leaders were both encouraging popular resistance to integration and advancing judicial challenges to the federal government's attempts to enforce Brown's mandate. A former president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors and award-winning journalist for the Nashville Tennessean, Mr. Siegenthaler served in the U.S. Justice Department as administrative assistant to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Our interview with him and his response to student questions allows students to synthesize the parts of the whole which define the role of law and the philosophical goals of the movement challenging segregation. In Chapter 7 of his book, Professor Arsenault recalls a conversation between Robert Kennedy and Dr. King that seems to reveal the challenge of Dr. King's idealism and the Attorney General's realistic concern for the political implications of movement philosophy. Later in that chapter, he writes that despite his growing impatience with the Freedom Riders' tactics and his lack of experience in civil rights matters, the Attorney General was ideologically and emotionally committed to racial equality. Could you share this aspect of his relationship with Dr. King in your own words, beginning with a brief account of the first time they met?
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's a good one, and I think it's a perfect place to begin. They come to office, and when they think about civil rights and race relations, the first thing that comes to mind is Little Rock and the tragedy there. Situation where Orville Faubus, the governor, calls out the National Guard not to enforce the court's order, but indeed to set up a bar so that black students can't cross the inner Central High School. And then the confrontation, troops are called in, there is chaos in the streets. Those pictures of parents, men and women, almost rabidly angry as these African American children enter Central High School. It was chaos in the streets. It was, the national media was all over it. It was a time when local papers, including ours, sent people to cover those sorts of conflicts, and so media coverage was massive. The Eisenhower administration took a terrible blow there, as did the state of Arkansas and the city of Little Rock. And in their minds, they are hopeful to find some way to keep civil rights movement in the courts and out of the streets. So, and I worked in that campaign, and after it was over, I went to work in the Justice Department, and I understand exactly where they were. They had carried the country because Lyndon Johnson, a Southern senator, a leader, with a record at that point of segregationist, with his help, they carried 5 states in the South. And they're already thinking as they come to office, you know, we need to try to keep this in the courts and out of the streets if possible. And so Dr. King, on his first visit, arranges this meeting with the Attorney General, and I was the note taker and the witness to the meeting. And so he opened the door on the conversation by saying to Martin King, the great problem in the South is political as much as anything else. And he proposed that Dr. King focus all the interest of the movement on voter registration. He describes the control that so many Southern senators and congressmen had on committees of Congress. And he said, you know, if you focus all your interest on voter registration and African and black citizens register to vote, there'll be great opposition to it. There'll be hostility. There'll be anger. There'll be violence. but I can win those cases quickly in the courts. And he pointed out that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, did not acknowledge that civil rights was a federal matter for his jurisdiction. And if you proceed in that way, we'll change the minds of Southern politicians. Dr. King's response was that of the ultimate idealist. And he said, I acknowledge the validity of everything you say. And we have a voter education project under a man named Wiley Branton in Atlanta. And that's going to be a big part of our effort. But for me, he said, it's my mission to take the movement wherever I find the evil, the corruption of racism, of segregation. And I must do so, he said, in a way that dramatizes. He knew exactly what the Attorney General was talking about, and he knew what he was talking about. I must do it in a way that dramatizes the evil, where I can demonstrate graphically for the people of the country through the media.
This evolves into your role in a Kennedy administration dealing with Southern culture and Southern politics in a general sense.
The bus station in Montgomery is their Little Rock. Floyd Mann surrounds my hospital with state troopers until the marshals arrive. And I'm sort of in and out of consciousness during that afternoon. It's late in the day before I talk to the Attorney General or to my wife. He went to my wife's home to let her know that I was all right, and that Byron White, who was Deputy Attorney General, had talked with me. And I guess I'm not the person that should say it, but it's been said by many others that the challenge to the administration to act would have happened whether or not I was there. But being there with the charge of both the President and the Attorney General to negotiate with the Governor of Alabama, I think substantially added to the burden of dealing with it immediately. I think what you're saying, Bob, is that from this point on, the illusion that you could handle it through the courts was gone.
Leaving Nashville and on our way to Birmingham, we watched Spike Lee's poignant documentary, Four Little Girls. When we arrive in Birmingham, we are met by Chris McNair, the father of one of the 4 girls killed in the Klan bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15, 1963, 17 days after the March on Washington. Following dinner hosted by Mr. McNair, the students have the opportunity to learn about the cold cases which were reopened more than 3 decades after the bombings. Doug Jones, leader of the prosecution teams in the cases of State of Alabama versus Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. and State of Alabama versus Bobby Frank Cherry, engaged the students in a discussion of the anatomy of those cases. His presentation is especially powerful because Mr. McNair is at his side. To be with these men makes the role of the law seem very real and personal to students who aspire to advance the cause of civil rights. Our next morning in Birmingham began with a visit to Old Bethel Baptist Church. Here, uniquely, the students saw unrenovated historical walls and features, and the scars of bombings directed at Fred Shuttlesworth for his personal leadership of Dr. King's Birmingham Direct Action campaign. As important as it is just to visit this legendary church, simply because of Reverend Shuttlesworth's contributions to the Birmingham campaign for civil rights, the unretouched visual sensations surrounding the presentation created a remarkably unique personal connection with movement history, and we felt a special need to film this class in a special way which emphasized the impact of environment on learning. Leaving Old Bethel, it seemed important to immediately take our students to a state-of-the-art presentation of movement history. In the auditorium of the nationally famous Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, we discussed the role of women in the movement with co-founder Odessa Woolfolk and freedom rider Catherine Burks Brooks. Miss Woolfolk emphasizes that Birmingham now embraces its past, neither forgetting nor dwelling on it, but using it to foster understanding, recognizing its redemptive importance in relationship to the present and future developments of human relations in Birmingham, the United States, and the world. Like Mary Jean Smith, Catherine Burks believed deeply in nonviolent protest, and as a young freedom rider, she went limp when forcibly arrested by segregationist Police Commissioner Bull Connor. But she was not afraid to respond to his personal threats as he abandoned her and her fellow companions at the Tennessee border, letting him know that they would see him back in Birmingham the next day. These two women allowed the students to see, in one presentation, the importance of the connection between storytelling and the Institute's cutting-edge visual presentation of history for students who were seeing these exhibits with two actual freedom riders as their docents. The capstone of our visit to Birmingham was to experience being inside the 16th Street Baptist Church and standing on the grounds of Kelly Ingram Park, where the breathtaking sculptures of Reverend Shuttlesworth and the sculptures of the mass arrests of children take on a special meaning, not just because of their artistic brilliance, but because our students view them knowing that they themselves are standing on the very same ground that movement veterans survived the fire hoses and attack dogs of a law enforcement system dedicated to white supremacy. In Montgomery, we were met by Randall Williams, co-founder of New South Books, publisher of Bus Ride to Justice, Beyond the Burning Bus, and The Life and Opinions of Alabama's Frank Johnson. Mr. Williams arranged a dinner with members of the Montgomery Improvement Association, some of whom, now in their 80s and 90s, had participated in the 1955 bus boycott. All of our texts described the boycott as a seminal event in the civil rights movement, and the students had extensive knowledge of its place in movement history. But they were now having dinner with some of those very people, and the discussion became almost familial. The Montgomery Greyhound Bus Terminal is another subject of the students' detailed readings, but to be at the scene, with the author of the definitive history of the 1961 Freedom Rides, and Rip Patton, one of the Freedom Riders who was present at the 2008 rededication of the restored terminal as a National Historic Place, allowed both a teacher and a Freedom Rider to guide the students' visualization of the attacks on the Freedom Riders and Mr. Siegenthaler's earlier stories of his experience on the ground as he attempted to oversee the Kennedy Justice Department's intervention in the chaos of white mob violence encouraged by Governor Patterson's complicity. Visiting the Southern Poverty Law Center fits John Dewey's commentary about history perfectly. Having been immersed in the immediate events of the movement, the students suddenly meet Morris Dees, the legendary co-founder of the SPLC, and his staff of lawyers and investigative reporters, led by Rhonda Brownstein and Mark Potok, and contemplate the continuing role of lawyers in using the power of the civil action against hate groups, the power of the media to expose their activities, and the power of providing law enforcement agencies with expertise and information with which to fight hate groups. Mr. Dees and Ms. Brownstein are also able to expose the students to the work of the Center's Immigrant Justice Project and Juvenile Justice Project. The uniqueness of the law firm's Courageous Practice Group is inspired by the Center's National Civil Rights Memorial, designed by Maya Lin, and dedicated to those who lost their lives between 1954 and 1968 in the continuing struggle for civil rights. All of our students and staff entered their names on the Center's Wall of Tolerance and touched the water that flowed over the names and events which define the history of the modern campaign for civil rights, as Maya Lin intended. Reinhold Niebuhr decades ago in Moral Man and Immoral Society, and Dr. King in many of his commentaries emphasized the need for both religion and law. And legal history does emphasize the moral premise of Brown v. Board and its progeny. But the actual visitation of movement churches, including Dr. King's own First Church at Dexter Avenue, and Ralph Abernathy's famous First Baptist Church, in which the Freedom Riders, Dr. King, and U.S. Marshals were trapped by the mob which had attacked them at the Montgomery bus station, is experimental learning. In his introduction to Fred Gray's book, Bus Ride to Justice, John Lewis describes lawyers and ministers as equally responsible for the movement's success. Having had the opportunity at the Southern Poverty Law Center to visit the modern environment of a law practice dedicated to civil rights, we were most fortunate to also have the opportunity to engage in a small group discussion of the legacy of Judge Frank Johnson with his successor, Judge Myron Thompson, who was appointed in 1980 at age 33 to succeed Judge Johnson as United States District Judge for the Middle District of Alabama. Judge Thompson welcomed the students not only to Judge Johnson's former courtroom, which had been fully restored under the oversight of Judge Thompson, but to his chambers, where Judge Johnson had held hearings and signed the orders which defined his role in movement history. That evening, Mr. Charles Wachter, who holds the unique distinction of having served as a law clerk to both Judge Johnson and Judge Thompson, arranged for us to have dinner with Judge Thompson. Mr. Wachter described the experience of serving as a federal law clerk for these two distinguished jurists, and then Judge Thompson engaged the students in a discussion of the relationship of trust that exists between federal judges and attorneys who appear before the court in federal question cases. For students of the role of law in the advancement of civil rights, these discussions of the connection between legal history and current civil rights cases was superlative small group learning, facilitated by lawyers and a judge whose roles have defined both eras. It was most appropriate that we would end our experiential learning in Selma, where the authentic and very personal displays in the unpretentious National Voting Rights Museum reminded the students that the struggle for voting rights continued beyond the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and produced one of the bloodiest attacks in movement history. After taking 1,100 pages of testimony and viewing the newsreel footage of the bloody attacks on marchers by state and local police, Judge Johnson quoted Chief Justice Marshall in McCullough v. Maryland that the Constitution is intended to be an enduring document and consequently to be adapted to the crises in human affairs. In an imaginative application of the doctrine of proportionality, he ruled that the enormity of the rights sought by the marchers and the enormity of the wrongs committed by state and local officials justified his order permitting a peaceful mass march along the 50-mile highway from Selma to Montgomery. By the time the march took place, President Johnson had submitted his voting rights bill to the Congress. Judge Johnson's use of the freezing principle in United States v. Alabama was incorporated into the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to suspend the racially motivated use of literacy tests and institute the now famous preclearance provisions which paved the way for Justice Department oversight of the integrity of the voting process. And so for law students and students of civil rights history to gather at Brown Chapel and then march together from Brown Chapel across the Edmund Pettus Bridge sealed the connection between us and the people of history who were now our heroes.